Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today regarding the Engineering and Manufacturing T level. Next slide, please, Ali. So today, using the platform webinar, send any questions area through the chat section. So chats or questions, that'd be great for us. You're all being set to mute mode. And then after the webinar, we'll be showing the resource to you. So you'll have a CPD certificate, a copy of this recording, and the slides and the webinar presentation will be available on our website. Next slide, please, Ali. So just to give us an overview of who we are, so we are the Engineering Manufacturing T-level team. So today it's myself, Sam Ashman, Technical Advisor for Engineering, the T-level lead. I've also got Ali on the call as well, who's our Technical Advisor for the Post-16. So we will be going through the slides regarding the employer set project and the core examinations regarding a high-level overview. On the call in the background, we've also got John O'Porter, our other Technical Advisor, and also Jazz from EAL, who's our T-level support at EAL. Next slide, please, Ali. So the agenda today is just a high-level overview of the core assessment, the assessment objectives related to the question types, the use of command verbs in questions, question types using sample assessments, hints and tips, teaching and learning guides, and support resources. And again, on this webinar, we will not be talking about the occupational specialism assessments, curriculum planning outside of technical qualification, or even progression onto industry placement. What we'll do now, I'll hand you over to Ali, who will talk about it in a bit more detail for you. Over to you, Ali.
Thanks, everyone. Can you hear me okay there, Sam?
Yes, can hear you fine, Ali.
That's better, thank you. Is that okay now? That's great. So hello, everyone. The main purpose of this webinar really is to provide a very high-level overview of the core assessments of the T-level technical qualification. So this webinar is aimed at centres who have already started their delivery in September. And as T-levels are brand new and the TQ or the technical qualification within the T-level is vastly different to other VRQ, MVQ type qualifications. So one of the biggest changes and challenges will be teaching to a syllabus which have end exams, just as there are in A-levels and GCSEs. So we will be providing a lot of information which are broken down into small digestible chunks. So this session is much more about ensuring centres and delivery teams understand the core assessment principles and practices. Now, we do know that there's going to be more detailed sessions on the core assessments prior to the first release of the ESP and the first release of the theory exam series, starting obviously in March, April, May. Now, this is when we provide more detail of what evidence you're going to need to provide and a further recap on the strategies of the core exams. So I've tried to approach this really from your perspective, and I've started with some usual questions that I would want to know the answers to, and to make sure that what is being covered today is going to be relevant to you. So I would want to know, how many assessments are there? What do the assessments look like? What's being assessed? How is it being assessed? When do I need to start preparing my learners for these assessments? Are there any resources there to support them? When do they take them? Can they resit, retake, improve the grade in the core? And if so, when can they do that? And how are they the core assessments marked and graded? So all these questions are going to be answered as we go through the webinar. So you will be delivering the common core pathway. Now, these all contain the same knowledge, as you can see, but each of them will have different component codes dependent on the actual T-level route. So the MIR route, the core will be, although it's the same for all of them, will be 873012. If you're doing the EMP route, it will be 873013, and the design and development will be the 873014. And of course, what's really important there is that your registration information, you must register for the core first before your occupational specialism. So I've just put that as a sort of, so it's only the core that we're going to be talking about today, which is the ones you can see there emboldened. So for the core assessments, learners must complete 2 externally set and externally marked exam papers. Now these cover the knowledge from the engineering core that we talked about previously on the last slide. There is also going to be 1 employer set project covering the knowledge and skills from either pathway. So what we will tell you is that the ESP will be slightly different for each pathway. Now all core assessments are provided by City and Guilds and marked by City and Guilds. So in other words, that's all externally set and it's all externally marked. Now, this example here is for the design and development pathway, and Sam's very kindly put where you can find this in your specification, which is page 20. So for the D&D, each of the 2 written papers are going to be 2.5 hours each, and they each have 100 marks for each of the papers. The employer set project for this particular pathway is 18.5 hours long in duration, and it's based on a series of 4 tasks and has 90 marks available for that. You can see there that the components of these are marked, awarded on a scale sort of A star to E, which is the same grading scale that is used for general qualifications there. So if we move on to the next one, the first on the top of the slide here, this is the MIR, which is the Maintenance, Installation, Repair pathway. Again, each of those 2 written papers are also 2.5 hours long each and have 100 marks for each of those papers. However, the employer set project in this particular pathway is only 12.5 hours in duration. And again, it's based on a series of 4 separate tasks and will have 90 marks available for that. For the one below it, which is the manufacturing, processing and control pathway, each of those 2 written papers, again, 2.5 hours each, and have 100 marks again. The employer set project is 15 hours in duration, and again, it's a series of 4 different tasks, 90 marks available. The weightings remain the same for the exams, regardless of which pathway you're on, which is 35% weighting for each of the papers, paper 1, paper 2, and 30% weighted for the ESP. So that's just an overview there. Now the exams, just for your information really, I'm happy to go into more detail in the next session, they're marked against a uniform mark scale, and this is set against before any grade boundaries have been set. So what happens is together with the ESP, the exams are scored on the uniform mark scale, then aggregated, which provides an overall grade for the core component. And as I mentioned before, that will be a grade of A star to E for the core components for those 3 or 2 separate assessments, were 2 papers and 1 ESP. So looking at some of the detail now in the exam papers. So each exam paper is going to be in 2 parts. So if we start with paper 1, so in this particular one, you can see here that part A has 67 marks in total. Now that will be the same for each of the exam series. There will always be around 67 marks, and they will be made up of typically 18 short to medium type answer questions, and they're what we have low to medium tariff marks awarded to them. So usually between 1 and a maximum of 4 marks for those particular types of question. And this is weighted to 70% of the overall exam, the part A of paper 1. Now part B has 33 marks in it, and that will include 3 extended response questions, which are the much longer response questions, and they will have a higher tariff mark for them, and usually marked against a banding scale between 6 marks and a maximum of 12. Now that is weighted at 30% of the exam. Now both core papers will follow exactly the same structure, but each core paper will cover a different technical content. Now you can see at the bottom of this page, you can see here what the focus and the content will be in paper 1. So in this paper, it'll always be essential. I'm not going to read them out because you can see them yourself, but on the left hand side of that, you can see numbers 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and they relate to the modules within the core. So paper 1 is only going to take information and questions from those 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, those modules that are numbered in that way. So you can see where the focus is going to be on those 18 short and medium answer questions, and obviously the extended response questions there. Now, if we look at this, what is important to understand on this is that both of these exams, paper 1 and paper 2, are profiled. So in other words, the level of difficulty will increase throughout the paper. So that starts with the lower demand questions at the beginning of the question paper, ending up at the higher demand questions at the very end of the question paper. So in section A, the questions are going to start with sort of things like name, list, state, demonstration of recall and understanding. And I'll look at the assessment objectives later on in the webinar. And that's to give a settling start to the assessment. The papers will then broadly build in demand and include questions requiring learners to apply their knowledge and understanding. So we've looked at the content on this one. So if we move on to paper 2, this is engineering in context. So this has part A is 70% weighted in the exam, and this again is 67 marks, but only with 11 short and medium type questions, again with a low and a medium tariff value. So again, these short answer questions will target recall of knowledge, demonstration of understanding, and application of knowledge and understanding. Now part B, 30% again, same as the last paper. Again, it's made up of 33 marks and will include 3 different extended response questions. And they target the analysis, evaluation, reflective type, command verbs, and will require those sort of hierarchy skills to answer this paper. And the questions in paper 2 are based on the content that you can see listed on the slide here, and there are 11 elements assessed or tested within paper 2, different to those assessed in paper 1. As I say, I'm not going to read the titles out because you do get the slides and you will get the recording of it after. And as I say, those numbers next to it just relate to the elements and topics in the core as listed in the qualification handbook. So what I will say is the weighting and the marks will stay the same for every exam series. So you know, for example, that in section B of the papers, there is always going to be 3 extended response questions. Now, the papers will be released in sequence. So paper 1 is released first, and exam paper 2 will be released approximately a week after exam paper 1. So moving on now to the employer set project part of the core. Now, rather than read all of this slide out, I'd much rather highlight some salient points really in it. So what is the ESP? So first of all, it's the ESP, the employer set project, which I'll refer to now as the ESP, is based on the knowledge theories and concepts of a problem, and really how to pull a plan together based on a series of tasks. Now, we would normally refer to this type of assessment as like a metacognition, which we put simply means it's thinking about one's thinking, or more precisely, it refers to the processes that that learner uses to plan, to monitor, and assess their understanding and own performance. Now, it's made up, in your case, a series, of this case, of 4 different tasks, and that takes place within a controlled assessment condition rather than an invigilated. And it is assessing the knowledge and the skills learned as part of the core only element of the T-level. Now, just to make it really clear where this word employer set project comes from. So City and Guilds develop every employer set project with employers from either our industry board and the industry. And that's to make sure that we constantly reflect realistic types of developments, activities and challenges. It is not connected in any way to the industry placement, or employers there, nor do you have to provide any evidence from employers for this particular assessment. So it's not related to the industry placement at all. So we said it's made up of 4 different tasks, and they will all relate to the same employer set project brief. And these tasks are going to be research, design, plan, and present. Although we mentioned before, each ESP will have different tasks within the brief relating to the specific pathway that you have chosen out of the 3 different pathways. Now, we said it's a realistic brief. It has to be achieved through completion of those skills, of those core skills of research, plan, present, review. And they are designed to produce appropriate evidence for assessment under those sort of controlled assessment conditions. But a new brief and new tasks will be set each series covering different topics. So I hope I've explained that in as much detail as you need there. So just a little bit more information on the ESP, really, as I say. So we mentioned that the project only draws from the content from the common core knowledge and skills, and that's the bit that sits across all of the core modules for engineering and the manufacturing common core. It's not anything to do with the occupational specialism, so we just need to make that clear, because that's assessed separately in a range of different, more practically based tasks. So this is just the common core. But the project is always going to be linked to the core skills, and they differ for each of the pathways. So in this example, I've used design and development. So in this particular pathway, the core skills for design and development, you can see there. So it's got core skill A, which is planning and preparation, core skill B, which is communication, core skill C, which is developing proposals and concept, and core skill D, which is evaluation there. So what may be different to other qualifications that you may have delivered in the past is that learners are going to be marked on the accuracy and the quality of the work that they're produced as well, that they produce. So this is quite key within the employer set project. So if I'm just moving on there, I'm just going to show you really high levels here, because I'm very aware that there's going to be a lot of information shared today. So this is just showing you a very high level overview and the tasks and the timings of the ESP for the design and development pathway. So as I mentioned, there's going to be a lot more detailed information in a webinar before the ESP is launched to you this year. So looking at that, you can see that there are 4 different tasks. We've mentioned them before. Each of those tasks is timed. So you can see for each of those tasks, there's a task duration for that to complete. And if we look at the, and it's 18, I think 18 and a half hours in total for this particular design and development ESP. The tasks are always going to be released in order of sequence. So you mustn't let learners complete tasks out of order. So therefore they can't do task 3 before task 2. They must do those in order. However, all of the tasks will be released to you as a centre at the same time, and that's to allow you to plan, prepare for planning, whether you need IT suites or whatever you need to do for sort of lecturer ratios, student cohort ratios. So they'll all be released to you, but mustn't be released to learners. It's only one at a time, and there will be a window that we're going to have a look at the times and the dates for that. So if you look at the right hand side to me of this slide, you can start to see the assessment objectives. Now these are absolutely key. We're only going to give you a high level at this stage, but we're going to go hugely into them in the next webinar. But you can see that the ESP is assessed against 5 assessment objectives, and they are weighted in respect of the skill level applied. So I'm just going to go through the next one before we have a look at those. But if you note straight away, if you can just have a quick look at AO2, you will see that is weighted at 50%, which is significantly higher than the other 4 assessment objectives. And AO2 is about the application of knowledge and skills. So moving on to the employer set project for MIR. So there are still 4 tasks. You can see how it's written down, and we'll be breaking this down so much further when we go into it before it's launched. But you've got 12.5 hours to complete this particular one. And there I've just provided some evidence on what information and what evidence you need to provide for marking for each of those tasks, bearing in mind that it's externally marked, but this is the type of evidence that you will be needing to upload to us to mark. So I'm not going to go into reading that because you're going to have obviously some information on that as we move along. So again, marks have been allocated for each of those tasks. Now what you will see here is that those marks have been based on the weighting of the assessment objectives and the level of skill that's required for that particular task rather than the time allocated. So the message really here is it's quality of work, not quantity of work, that where the marks are allocated. So you can see straight away, there's 24 marks for a 2.5-hour task as opposed to 24 marks for a 4-hour task, because task 4 is deemed as having a higher skill level than task 2. You'll also see here that the maths, English and digital skills make up 9% of those marks, or it says 9 marks, which is 10% overall of that particular assessment. Again, you can see how it's weighted on the assessment objectives there. Moving on to the final one, I think this is the EMPC employer set project. Again, still 4 tasks. But 15.5 hours to complete the ESP for this one. Before the ESP is launched, as I say, we will be breaking down all of the assessment objectives and showing you how they are used in the marking grid. And again, you can see here that assessment objective AO2 has got the same weighting as all right the way throughout, which is 50%. Now, the reason this is so high is it is an off-qual requirement that 50% of the marks have to be weighted on application of knowledge and skills. And of course, this is going to become so much clearer as we start to unpick how those marks are allocated against each of the assessment objectives, and really what is being assessed in each task, and as importantly, what is not being assessed in each task, because that's as important. So moving on to slide 19, which answers really quite nicely one of the question bubbles earlier. So this is where we've included your timelines for the first core assessments in 2023, beginning in March 2023. So what will happen here is on the 6th of March, all of the employer set project tasks will be released to you as a centre. Then that window opens for that delivery of that assessment from the 13th of March to the 31st of March. And you have to make sure that the deadline for any evidence upload is on the 31st of March and not later than that. In June, you will have exam paper 1, and we know it's 2.5 hours, followed by a week later, 13th of June, exam paper 2. And we've probably put these, we've got special consideration requests there. So moving on to the next sort of look here about the autumn series, you can see here that there is an autumn series. Some people refer to it as a resit or a retake or an improvement of grade. It is neither of those. It is just another opportunity, but it's an opportunity for you to take. You may decide that you're going to wait to take your first assessment in October rather than in March. But presently, all core assessments have to be taken at that sitting, so you can't separate those sittings. So if you decide you're not going to carry out any assessments until the autumn, you will then get the papers released to you on the 30th, the ESP released to you on the 30th of October. Then you employ a set window is the 6th of November to the 24th of November. You upload it, deadline is the 24th of November. Exam paper 1 starts on the 28th of November. Set time, it's a time and dated exam, which means it has to be sat at that time on that date, followed by a week later at exam paper 2. So it's giving you some, these dates I think have been confirmed now because JCQ were a little bit late printing their general qualifications timeline. So these dates have been confirmed now. So moving on to the next section. So I'm just going to be looking at the command verbs in relation to the types of questions that you're going to be seeing in the theory exam. So I think, first of all, we always say, what are command verbs to learners? Because they may have not been used to this now because they've had 2 years where they may have either lost those skills or not actually been taught those skills because of what's happened with COVID. So command verbs are the words and phrases that we use in exams and assessment tasks, and these tell the learners how they should answer the question. And it's really key that learners are trained to recognise and respond to the different command verbs because it tells them the level and depth of response that the examiner is going to be looking for. Now, I just included this infographic here that you can cut and paste and stick it sort of anywhere that you can use just to introduce those learners to those command verbs, because these are the most common ones that you're going to be finding in the exams. Now, I'm not going to spend, I know that's a huge lot of information on there, but without spending too much time on these next 2 slides, I really wanted to give you a head start with supporting your learners in understanding and responding to those different command verbs as early as you possibly can. Now, as I mentioned, some learners may not have actually taken any exams for 2 years, and this is why it's key to reintroduce this, to bring back those forgotten or lost exam technique skills that are so normally taught in schools and colleges. So I've produced this list for you in a table format that you can use to help with the definition and the meanings of each of these command verbs and the typical assessment objectives that are used for them. So if we look at on the likely AOs, AO1A is basic recall, and AO1B, which is slightly broken down, is demonstrate understanding, a little bit beyond recall. So in this slide, I've concentrated on all the AO1A and AO1B command verbs by the typical names of those, and these are the ones that are used for the earlier questions for recall and understanding. So there'll be sort of questions like identify, label, list. I'm not going to read them out, but these are the command verbs and the definition of what the learner is being asked to do for those. So my biggest hint and tip is get them used to answering this and understanding what they're being asked to do. So each, you can see that there is going to be a different value for the different types of command verbs. So we mentioned before about short or low tariff type questions, and these AO1As are your 1-2 point type marks there. So that's where the learners just have a recall and you'll get a separate point per mark. Whereas if we move into sort of AO1B, that comes to short, medium tariff type questions, and they may have sort of 1 point for a limited explanation with a further mark or more marks available for an in-depth type of explanation. Now, I've done the same here for the assessment objectives AO2, application of knowledge and understanding, which, as you know from the previous slides, carries the highest weighting across all of the theory exams. So these will be the higher tariff, longer 6 to 12 mark discuss type questions that expect a higher quality of response. So if you think back to part B of your 3 extended response questions in part B of your papers, these are the type of questions, command verbs, that are going to be used in those extended response questions, and they're usually marked giving a particular level of response on a band. So they'll have a banding sort of grading criteria through it. And there are going to be examples of these as we move through the webinar. So I've just put those. So again, really help you to get your learners used to what these verbs mean. So this, I'm coming to the end of my little bit now, you'll be glad to hear. So on slide 24, I've just broken this down slightly to sort of explain how command verbs in questions, how this works in practice, really. So if we look against, you can see there in AO1A, I've also said it's sort of demonstrate knowledge, ability to recall. AO1 sort of B refers to incidents where they've got demonstration of basic recall, and the exam is 10% weighted on those short answer questions of list, name, state, those identify. So there's 10% of the whole exam based on that particular weighting. If we move to AO1B, it's a little bit beyond recall, so they're just asking them a little bit more in-depth questions, which could be explain, it could be describe, and that's the ability to make sure that they understand beyond basic recall, and that's 22% of the overall weighting for the theory exam. However, AO1A and AO1B together, it's 32% of the overall exam, which is quite a high weighting. If we look at AO2, that is 46% of all the exam will be questions relating to application of knowledge and skills. And the AO3, which are the longer, extended, more analyse, evaluate, reflect type questions, have 22% weighting on the exam. So if we look at short answer AO1, medium AO1B, AO2, and higher tariff questions, using marking bands AO2 and AO3. So I know that's an awful lot of information, but it just gives time to sort of digest this. So looking at this now, there are only 3 assessment objectives that are used for the theory exam, as opposed to 5 in the ESP. So the assessment objectives for the core exams that you can see here have been developed by Ofqual and IFATE across all of the technical qualification core assessments. Now, we're going to break these down really into minute detail in the next webinar, but AO1, we know it's about recall, AO2 application, and AO3 analyse. And I've just put there's some explanation in the qualification handbook there that sort of allows you to read about the assessment objectives descriptions in detail. So this is, before I hand over, this is my slide following on from the last one. Now, I said it was broken down slightly before, so it's just giving you that explanation so you can see, how does AO1A differ from AO1B? What is the difference between ability to demonstrate basic recall and ability to demonstrate beyond basic recall of definitions? So on this slide, you can see that how those descriptions are laid out. But what I will say is, understanding these assessment objectives really is the key to the theory exam. And to highlight it further, the verb will always relate to the skill demand, which then relates to the number of marks. So we know that state will be worth the lower end of the mark tariff, as they only access recall, and whereas we know the larger mark questions, as both of those papers are profiled, are going to be at the end of the paper, and they're going to be based on ability to analyse, evaluate, and they will use verbs like justify, evaluate, discuss. So what will happen is those learners will get all AO1 questions first, followed by AO2, and they'll finish on AO3, and that's why how the level of demand will increase. So in this column, you can see there's the assessment objective, meaning in the middle is a detailed description, and the last column there shows the weighting for it. Now, this is in the qualification handbook, but in the next few slides, Sam is going to provide some examples of how this actually works in practice. So over to you, Sam.
Thank you, Ali, for that. That's much appreciated, and actually really interesting around in how the assessment objectives and how the ESP will work towards this programme. Now I'm going to look at the exam papers in a bit more detail for an engineering, just an engineering context regarding related to the commands and verbs and question types. Next slide, please. So we're going to do some examples of the question type. So we're looking at the core exam. So we're going to take some of the questions from the paper 1 and paper 2, and then also the extended response questions. These are available on our website under the code of 8730, and you can have a look at these in more detail as well. So next slide, please. So if we look at paper 1, section A, so this is on the example of question number 17, and it's about a company manufacturing a hard hat from metal alloys, and they need to explain how this affects the performance of a hard hat when subject to an impact, and it's about the crystalline structure. So it's taken from the material spec. And as you can see, the command verb here is called explain. So in other words, making it clear. Within the mark scheme, as you can see for the mark scheme, we've got a couple of points on there. So it's a 4-mark question, and each mark has been allocated with a further marks for the expansion part of it. So in other words, in the metal cannot be relieved by slippered planes in the atoms. The atoms will be randomly distributed rather than crystallized planes. Reduced potential deformation, and the hat will absorb less energy. And this will result in toughness of the hard hat being breaking lower. Increase in the hard hat will break when subject to impact. The hard hat could be subjected to a high level of impact damage, therefore will be unsuitable for use. So others, a brief description of what happens, and then explain a bit more detail about how it will affect its performance as well. So that just gives a quick on a 4-mark question. Next slide, please. So then we're now looking at paper 2, and this is only a 1-mark question. And as you can see, this is based on the health and safety. And when managing risk in a manufacturing environment, a hierarchy of control is used. The first step in hierarchy is to emulate the risk. State the other 4 steps in order of the hierarchy. So we can see on this one, this is state. We also got that to understand that it needs 4, order, and hierarchy. So they're going to get 1 mark if they put all the 4 steps in the correct order, and also identifying what each correct step is. So we've got reduction, substitution, engineering control is to isolate, changing the working method, administrative costs, training, safe system of work, and PPE. And again, the learners will not be given any alternate marks for any alternative response. So as you can say, regarding to the qualification spec regarding risk assessments and the health and safety. So that's how a 1-mark question can be split down as well. Next slide, please. So we're now looking at the extended question responses that Ali described earlier. So this is taken from the actual qualification. and it says a manufacturing company is considering use of renewable sources of power for new factory. The factory will have a number of electrically powered machine processes which are expected to operate continuously. The factory is in a high altitude rural location with no nearby rivers and limited access by road. Evaluate the different power sources available and suggest the most suitable needs for this company. And this is a 12-mark question. So in other words, it's stretching and challenging those learners for the AO2 and AO3. And as you can see, the key parts highlighted is evaluate and suggest. So what we're going to do now, we're going to break that question a bit more down into a bit more further on the next slide, please. And as you can see, we now highlighted the key parts. So we've got renewable sources of power, operated continuously, it's a high altitude rural, no nearby rivers and limited access by road. And we're going to evaluate the different power supplies and suggest the most suitable. So as you can see, we've got the command verbs evaluate, so others consider several options and ideas and suggest, others give possible answers. So when you break that down in third part of it, you can see what we need to talk. So we need to talk about different types of renewable power sources, how it can be operated continuously. Because the factory is in a high altitude road, you can't use anything to do with water, so there's no nearby rivers. And with it having limited access by road, how is it going to get across? So again, thinking about this most suitable task for that company as well. So on the next slide, please. So what we do have is the different mark bands. So as you can see, for a mark band 1, which is 1 to 3 marks, it gives a demonstration of basic use of different types of power sources, basic application, and basic evaluating skills, but it doesn't give any clarity. Well, if we look at mark band 3, so 7 to 9 marks, analysing different types of power sources, application of the knowledge and understanding, justifying responses and why the responses are clear. And then to get the higher mark bands, the 10 mark bands, we've got a comprehensive use of analysis, and you can see in the indicative content, that's the comprehensive part, demonstrating comprehensive application of knowledge, evaluative skills and reasoning, and using logical structures that maximize understanding. So we're using that engineering terminology. So in the indicative content, we've got, it should be solar and wind panel as the main option, because again, we're not close to any water, so we can't use any water power. And that's because use of biofuel. Continuous operation, so solar cells only produce electricity during the day, where wind produces at night. So you think of those two power supplies. Space needed, so how much we need for solar powers, how many for wind farm, for example, or wind turbine. Solar panels could be installed into the factory roof, so otherwise offsetting that space, depends how big the company is. We also think about the factory, increase the wind power. We also about the location, so we've got to think about the animals around that rural location as well, and also the different types of energy. So in other words, how can solar power produce from energy and generations as well? So in other words, giving that full detail and the reason behind it will give you the maximum marks. And that's what we're expecting to see in those high level questioning papers. Next slide, please. What I will do now is pass you back to Ali, and you'll talk about the ESP and the assessment objective tasks.
Thanks, Sam. So just to provide a high level overview of each of the ESPs that we've looked at here. So this one, the first one is looking at the assessment objectives for the employer set project for design and development there. You can see before, we've had a look briefly before, but there are 5 assessment objectives. We know they're different to the AOs for the core theory exams, as these are based on the 4 ESP tasks and the core competencies that we looked at earlier. So I'm not going to read them out because it is just that you can see there are slightly different weightings for each of the ESPs, and those weightings are rounded to the nearest whole number. Now, again, just as it is in the 3 assessment objectives for the theory exams, for the core theory, it's really worth familiarising yourself with these AOs in preparation for the next session, because we're going to be breaking these down for each task and then allocate it, looking at where those marks can be gained for those learners. So again, it's always going to be AO2 is going to be highly weighted at 50%. But you can see the assessment objectives are very different. So the first thing about the 4 tasks is planning. So the first one is how do those learners plan? They want to see evidence of that first task, which is a planning task, and 13% of the ESP is weighted against that particular assessment objective. How they apply their core knowledge and skills is obviously 50%. So that's the real sort of core skills that we looked at before, communication, planning. And of course, that's 13% is given on, did that learner select the relevant techniques and resources to meet the brief? So when they get the brief of the ESP, the 13 of those percentage will be allocated against looking at how that learner approached that task and what techniques that they used and resources they used. I mentioned before that AO, Maths, English and Digital is assessed, and that's 10% weighted. Again, it's 9 marks, I think, on the ESP, but it's 10% weighted against a percentage. And that's about use of maths, English and digital. And we're going to be breaking those down. So I would imagine you're going to see quite a lot of sort of measurements in context and sort of mathematical equations type thing. And of course, the use of ICT and digital will be tended to be used more in the presentation, where they will hopefully use PowerPoint or some form of media. And then the evaluation skills, which is about them giving a reflective or evaluative summary at the end of that project, is weighted at 13%, which is all about how they approach their evaluation task at the very end, which, as I said, we will be providing more detail. Slightly different to the, not much different really. I think the weightings are just slightly different for the maintenance, installation, repair. They all have exactly the sort of same assessment objectives. It's just the weightings that are different there. And if we move on to the final one, which is the MPC one, we can see again slightly different weightings again there to the first one, and it's the exactly the same AOs for those as well. So it just gives you a really brief overview of where those marks can be gained and what they're being marked against. Now, this is where we're going to be starting in the next webinar. So we would expect you to have had an understanding of what we talk about now with marks, and we're going to be breaking down each separate task, giving you the evidence that we require you to upload, how long you've got to do it, what type of evidence we need, what sort of video format we want it in, and we're going to be breaking task by task for those down. So that's where our starting point is on the next video. And again, it's going to include 3 separate pathways, so we can have a really deep dive into the ESP for each of those pathways. So before I hand back to Sam for the final part of this webinar, I've just included a couple of really simple hints and tips that you can start your learners off now, really. An infographic, you know, get that up as soon as you can and drill that into those learners and introduce it as soon as possible. And also let learners know when the exams are, because we've had a little bit of flexibility over the last couple of years due to COVID, and you know that flexibility is no longer available. So they do need to know which sessions that, you know, they're going to be sitting the exams, because if they've missed it, they can't just sit it the next day. They'll have to wait for the next exam series, and let them also know which sessions you're going to be going through for exam prep for them. You know, you don't need to be told how to bring it all in, but I always find sort of, you know, some of the media tools that are available, the sort of interactive tools that you can download free online, are brilliant for sort of quizzes and stuff, and getting them ready for presentations and things. You know, I don't know how many processes and legislative policies that there are in engineering and manufacturing, suspecting quite a few. So get them to make mnemonics up themselves just to remember it by. And again, the tasks that really need those learners to gain those higher marks are going to be research, sort of drafting an email, particularly presentation skills. If we can start getting them ready now with those skills. Even every single sort of lesson, bring those skills in about research, how to note take, you know, how do they draft an email, because they're used to text language so much. And I think I personally would share with my learners what they're going to be assessed on. I'd show them the marking grids, and I'd, you know, go through all the sample support resources so they know exactly how they're going to be marked. So that's enough of me, and I'm sure that you've had enough. So I'm going to hand back to Sam for the final few slides. And thank you for listening to my bit. So back to you, Sam, there.
Thanks, Sally, for that. While I've been talking throughout the webinar, I've been putting links in our chat as well. So you can think about the links regarding events to webinar pages, links to the actual teaching and learning assessment guides, and as well as the ESP guidance as well. So I've just put all those links in the chat, so please do download those. But as always, please make sure you signed up to our communications and our e-bulletins, and make sure you do that email updates. And this is where you get all the up-to-date information that's coming through. Our website is full of information, and again, we do short snippets of our webinars, but again, this is where you can find most of the information. And also, you might have noticed through LinkedIn, we've got some provider networks events, so face-to-face in Wakefield and London, and also doing some face-to-face coming to your centres as well, and supporting you with your on-programme onboarding and delivery as well. So the next slide, please. So regarding those that's been discussed and been put into chat, put the resource hub link in there. The learner flyer, ideal for recruitment. Again, this is all available on our T-level page. The resource hub is the main one-stop for everything. And again, it's that e-bulletin where you get everything to do with T-levels, not just for engineering, but all the other T-levels that we do offer at City and Girls. And also, if you'd like to join your employees to join our employee industry board, then again, is linked to that employee industry board activities as well. Next slide, please. So people have been asking me when is the next webinar in the chat. So our next event is on the 3rd of Feb at 3 o'clock. And this is just asking any questions that we've discussed regarding this event webinar today. And that's via Microsoft Teams. And there's a link to there. So I'll just put the link in there, and just make sure you go via our events and webinar page, and you can actually click on that link as well. We then will be advertising when our ESP's webinars are going to be, so only for middle of Feb, so just after half-term break. So again, you can see all information on there. As always, at the end of the webinar, you're going to get a copy of the recording. You're also going to get a CPD certificate. But again, all the actual slides, PDF the slides and the events and decks are also on our webinar page, or our events and webinar page under engineering. And any future webinars that we do so recording, we've got a dedicated engineering go-to channel as well. So not just about T levels, but other qualifications we do offer as well. Next slide, please. As always, we like to support our providers, so anything that comes up. So if you've not already understood that, the industry placement delivery guidance has now been updated, so do click on that link to see about what's regarding placements. And again, anything further going forward regarding T-levels, funding, delivery, etc. We like to share these links at all of our events, just to making sure that you've got that one-stop shop for all the links. Next slide, please. Everyone keeps asking, when is the engineering manufacturing T-level core textbooks going to be released? Well, this is through Order of Education, not City and Girls. So we have been told it's going to be June 2023. I do recommend you get in touch with Order of Education. The contact there is Gemma Simpson, so if you want to advance sample chapter. But again, this is going to be in June 2023. Next slide, please. And as always, we're always on the shout out and recruitment stage. So again, if you want to mark exam papers, looking at the ESP, or looking at the actual occupational specialism, then we're always looking for associates to work with us. And there's a variety of different jobs available on our associate vacancy page. If you need some further information, then do look on our associate vacancy page, or do contact myself direct. We're always looking to see how people can support us, and when supporting the delivery of T-levels to make it successful. Next slide, please. So that comes to the end of our webinar. We've had a couple of questions in the chat that's come through. So what we can do is we can go through what's been asked and what hasn't been asked. So thank you very much. So the first question we got was, how many question items are in the exam paper? So if you refer to our paper spec on 8730, paper 1 had 21 questions and paper 2 had 14 questions. Regarding the ESP, we'll go over that in a bit more detail on our next webinar regarding templates. What I do recommend is look at the sample assessments on the 8730 and also look at the guidance regarding the ESP as well. And I have put some links in the chat section. Students rely on computers, tasks, and some are not allowed to use the internet. Can we have a spell checker? Again, these will be identified in the guidance, so I'll always check on that and also on the ESP documentation as well. And that will be in more detail when we join our next session. Another question on there is, design and development task takes 8 hours, can it be split? As long as you are controlling that assessment, then please do what makes suitable for you. But again, always check the ESP guidance and also on the task as well. So we will go through that in a bit more detail.
Can I come in on that one, Sam? Is that okay?
That's fine, Ali.
Oh, yes, sorry, thank you. You're going great guns there. Yeah, sorry, Stuart. Yeah, absolutely, it can be split. You can either do it in, you know, 2 4-hour sessions. You can do it in 8 1-hour sessions. The problem that it has to be consecutive sessions, and also you need to be able to store the material. Those learners must not be able to take that material out of the room. So that's something you may need to think about, is how you're going to store that, whether it be on a pen drive, whether you take it off them a lock cupboard or something. But any of those tasks that are over sort of 3 hours can always, or any time, can be split. Okay, so that's not a problem at all.
Thanks, Ali. For the exam paper about scientific calculators, yes, scientific calculators can be used as long as it's not programmable. So that's one thing as well. Forum sheets, yes, we will be providing a forum sheet. There is a sample currently on our website, so please check under the code 8730. We next task we've got regarding grade boundaries for the paper. Ali, can you help on this one for regarding grade boundaries?
Yeah, there are no grade boundaries yet, because they go through an awarding process, very similar to how an A-level or, you know, an A-level is marked. So there is no distinction, merit and pass for any exams, because they all are graded A star to E. So what happens is those exams are marked out of 100, and then they are put against a uniform mark scale, which is a common scale that's used before any grade boundaries are set. So it's a bit of a norm referencing type of assessment there. So each year there will be a sort of a different grade boundary. So there won't be the same grade boundaries each year, and it will depend on the cohort. And what happens is they go through an awarding process to get that bell curve. So you'll be told each year sort of what last year's grade boundaries are, so they will be altering there. So you don't have to do anything for those. They are marked by City and Guilds, and all 3 papers, so the 2 exam papers are marked against uniform mark scale. Then the ESP, before the grade boundaries are set, gone through awarding, and then they are aggregated to come out against a algorithm, really like a sum, which gives the grading A star to E. Sorry, that's a bit complex, isn't it? Sorry, Sam.
It's fine, not a problem. These are the questions that's coming through, so at least we're getting an update on this one. One question, will the paper 1 and paper 2 be exactly the same for all 3 pathways? Yes, that is correct. So if you've got 20 learners across different T-level pathways, then they will be sitting paper 1 on the same day and paper 2 on the same day. And then we've got a question regarding a type of calculator. What I recommend you do is if you email me direct to the picture of the calculator, what I can do, I can check that with our quarter team to see if this calculator can be used for examinations. I'm not too sure about that calculator and that brand. So again, just to making sure it's right, and especially for your learners, then do please email us and we can check that out for you. And that is all the, we've got last one what's just come in before we shut down, is can students resit to improve grades, Ali?
Absolutely, yeah. They can resit up to 3 times and up to 2 years after they finish the qualification. Although how that works and how you're going to get them back, I'm not quite sure on that. But yes, they can resit and they can retake, and it is the best mark that counts. What you will have is 2 exam series per year. Now, that's not just for resit. So as I said, you may decide to sit in the summer, and those learners can improve, resit, or even take for the first time in autumn. If you sit in autumn for the first time, then they've got the following summer series to take or resit or re-improve. However, a word of caution. If at the moment, all of the core assessments have to be taken in one sitting, as you know, so it's the ESP. So if you do the ESP and you do the theory exams, they all have to be either in the summer or the autumn series together at that time. However, if they fail the ESP and pass the core exams, they only have to take the bit that they failed the next time for the resit. So the first time, they all have to be taken together. The second time, if they pass the ESP and fail the exams, they have to take both of those papers, because it's not separate exams, it's one exam split over 2 papers. So I hope that's a little bit, is that okay, Sam? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you, Ali, for that. So that is all our questions. So thank you very much for joining us today. It's been much appreciated. Thank you for your great questions. These are really, really good. Please come and join us as our Q&A session is on the 3rd of Feb to ask any more further details regarding the ESP or the core. And we look forward to meeting you all on our next webinar. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, everybody.